Okay, so today we're going to explore something, that might feel surprisingly personal, and that's childhood emotional neglect. We're diving deep into Running on Empty by Jonice Webb. And honestly, this book, it's packed with those aha moments that kind of make you see yourself and your past in a whole new light.
Yeah, it's interesting about this book is it tackles this form of childhood adversity that I think is often overlooked. Like we tend to focus on the big, dramatic events,
Mhm.
but Webb really shines a light on something much more subtle, and that's the profound impact of what didn't happen.
And that's what I think makes this so relevant to, well, probably everyone listening, right? Because it's not just about overt abuse or trauma. It's about those everyday moments, those small moments where our emotional needs, maybe as children, weren't fully met. Like, have you ever just felt unseen or unheard, even in a loving family? And that's, I think, the territory that we're really going to be exploring today.
Exactly. And, the book really emphasizes that this isn't about pointing fingers at parents. It's not blaming them. Even well-intentioned caregivers can unknowingly fall short when it comes to providing what's called emotional validation, that crucial feeling of being seen, heard, and understood for who you are.
Let's dig into that a bit because emotional validation, this is a term I think we'll be coming back to again and again, but what does that even actually look like in practice and, how does its absence actually affect us?
So imagine a child who's feeling scared or sad, right? Emotional validation means that the parent acknowledges and accepts those feelings without judgment or dismissal. So it's saying something like, I see that you're feeling scared right now, and that's okay. I'm here for you. And when that consistent validation is missing, children, they can internalize this message that their feelings are wrong or a burden, and this can manifest in different ways as adults.
Yeah, and the book actually opens with this pretty powerful example of this. Webb tells the story of Robin, a woman who, on the surface, seems to have it all. She's got a successful career, seemingly perfect life, but she ends up attempting suicide after what appears to be just a minor, trigger.
Yeah, and Robin's story is kind of a stark reminder of how deeply buried emotional neglect can be.
Yeah.
So we learned that her parents, while loving in their own way, had this like zero tolerance policy for any negative emotions.
Mm-hmm.
As a result, Robin learned to just suppress her true feelings, constructing this facade of happiness that ultimately crumbled.
Yeah, I found that so chilling, but also insightful. It's easy to think, well, that's not my story. I didn't experience anything that extreme. But Robin's story, I think it really illustrates how seemingly small everyday interactions can have this cumulative effect. And it really shapes how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive, I think, the world around us.
Precisely. And that's why recognizing, the signs of childhood emotional neglect is so crucial. And
Yeah.
again, it's not about self-diagnosis, but it's understanding the potential roots of our like present day struggles. It's about connecting the dots between our past and our present experiences.
So let's talk about those signs. What are some red flags that might, suggest that someone is kind of carrying the legacy, I guess we could say, of emotional neglect? What did you notice reading through Running on Empty that really stood out to you?
Well, the book gives this pretty comprehensive list of signs and signals throughout things like, difficulty asking for help, maybe feeling different or disconnected from others, a tendency to isolate, and like a struggle to identify or even express emotions. And these aren't, always like glaringly obvious. They could be really subtle.
It's like those times when, maybe you find yourself struggling to even articulate how you feel, or you're always downplaying your own needs, putting others first. It's almost like you're emotionally, I don't know, numb or kind of disconnected from what's going on inside.
Exactly, exactly. And often we like internalize those struggles as personal failings. We think, oh, I'm just too sensitive or ugh, I'm just not good at relationships. But we don't realize those patterns might actually stem from from this lack of emotional validation in childhood.
Yeah, it's like we're running on empty, like the title of the book suggests, but we never learned how to actually refuel ourselves emotionally. We're just kind of like surviving on fumes, and it shows up in how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to other people. It affects everything.
Yeah, that's such a powerful, powerful way to put it. And the book, it does offer a lot of hope in that regard because it stresses that emotional neglect doesn't have to define us.
Hmm.
It's something we can heal from.
And that's such a relief to hear because I think so much of what we've, discussed so far can feel, I don't know, pretty heavy. So what are some of the key things? What can people actually do to start filling the tank, as Webb puts it?
Well, the first step, like we touched on earlier, is awareness,
Yeah.
right? It's about recognizing those signs, connecting the dots between those early experiences and your kind of present-day emotional landscape.
Okay, so awareness is key, but it's not enough to just intellectually like understand it, right? Like we
Yeah.
have to actually do something with that awareness.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's where the rubber meets the road. And Webb, he provides this whole toolbox of like practical strategies and exercises aimed at helping you develop, first of all, a deeper understanding of your emotions, but then also practicing self-care and cultivating self-compassion, that inner loving but firm voice that many of us, just we missed out on.
You've mentioned this inner voice a couple of times. Can you unpack that a bit more? Like what does that even sound like?
Yeah, so it's about kind of developing this internal dialogue that's kind and patient and understanding, as opposed to being, harshly self-critical. So imagine like a voice that says, "Hey, it's okay to feel this way," or "You're doing the best you can," rather than that inner critic that's like, "Ugh, you're such a mess," or "Come on, you should be over this by now."
So it's about treating ourselves like with the same compassion and understanding that we would offer a close friend or a loved one, even when we, make mistakes when we're struggling.
Precisely, and that's a skill, honestly, that takes practice, especially if we didn't, grow up with that kind of modeling. But the book, I mean, it offers some great techniques for cultivating that inner voice.
Like what? Give us something concrete that we can like start doing today.
Yeah, so one practice that Webb recommends is journaling. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, just, even just a few minutes each day to kind of check in with yourself, explore your thoughts and feelings without judgment. It's about like bringing awareness to those inner voices and starting to shift the dialogue to something that's a little more, you know, compassionate, a little more supportive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like we're becoming our own best friend in a way, our own kind of source of support and encouragement.
Exactly. And that self-compassion, it's essential for healing. But it's also, about taking concrete action to meet your own needs. Webb is a big advocate for things like setting boundaries,
Mm.
learning to say no more often, and just carving out time for things you genuinely enjoy.
I love how she emphasizes like the practical aspects of self-care.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about like bubble baths and face masks, right? It's about making choices that prioritize your well-being, even if they're small.
Right. And that can feel almost revolutionary, especially for those of us who are, used to putting everyone else first.
Now, something else that really struck me in the book was the discussion of different types of like emotionally neglectful parents. And there are 12 in total, which it feels a bit overwhelming, but you're right. It's not about like labeling people. It's more about just recognizing patterns and understanding like the dynamics at play.
And those dynamics, often stem from the parent's own unresolved experiences. And Webb points out that a lot of emotionally neglectful parents, they're simply repeating what they learned in their own families.
Yeah.
So it's this cycle that can be passed down through generations.
That makes a lot of sense. So instead of, focusing on all 12 types, why don't we why don't we hone in on a couple that might be particularly relevant to, our listeners today? And one that really stood out to me was the well-meaning but neglected themselves parent. And these are, parents who love their kids deeply, but they're so emotionally unavailable themselves that they struggle to meet their children's emotional needs.
Yeah, and that's such an important one to highlight because it underscores that good intentions aren't always enough, right? These parents, they might be dealing with their own, unresolved trauma, mental health challenges, or even just the like overwhelming demands of life. And they might not even be aware that their actions or even their inactions are having this negative impact.
And the book shares this really poignant story about a woman named Sally, and her father had died when she was young, and her mother, consumed by grief, just kind of became emotionally withdrawn. And while her mother loved her very much, she wasn't able to really provide the emotional support that Sally needed during such a, formative time.
Yeah, and Sally's story is a perfect example of how even in the absence of like, abuse or malice, emotional neglect can have this lasting impact.
And another type that resonated with me, and I think this might be particularly relatable for a lot of listeners, is it's called the child as parent dynamic. And this is where a child is kind of forced to take on these adult responsibilities, often due to a parent's, illness, addiction, emotional instability. There's a lot of reasons why this can happen.
And the impact on the child can be, really significant. They're robbed of the chance to just be a kid, to have their own needs met unconditionally, and instead they learn to be, hyper responsible, self-sufficient, often at the expense of their own emotional development.
And we actually see this play out in Sally's story as well, because, after her father's death, she became like fiercely independent, emotionally self-sufficient, and she was taking care of not only her own needs, but also her mother's emotional well-being.
Which is heartbreaking,
Yeah. Huh.
because children, they're not equipped to be the emotional caretakers of their parents.
Mhm.
It's a complete role reversal that can have like really long-lasting consequences.
Yeah, it's like they're almost robbed of that, that chance to just be a kid, to have their own needs met. And then as adults, it's like, are they always then, What's that? Are they always going to struggle with intimacy and setting boundaries? Like, how does that manifest, later on?
Yeah, and they might struggle to allow themselves to be vulnerable too. And they might even kind of recreate those same dynamics in their own relationships, maybe even subconsciously seeking out partners who, reinforce those familiar patterns.
It's true. It's like that saying, we repeat what we don't repair, right? But I think,
Hmm.
the good news is, like, as Webb emphasizes throughout the book, it's never too late to break the cycle. And a big part of that, as we've been discussing, is, it's learning how to fill our own tanks.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that, taking care of our own emotional needs, that's not selfish. It's essential, really. I mean, it's the foundation for, a healthier, a more fulfilling life for sure. And it's also the greatest gift, honestly, that we can give to our loved ones, especially, our children.
Because when we model that emotional intelligence, that self-compassion, it creates this like ripple effect, right? And it extends like far beyond ourselves, I think. We break those generational patterns and kind of pave the way for hopefully, a more emotionally healthy future.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Now, you mentioned earlier that you loved how Webb actually gets really specific about like the practical aspects of self-care and emotional intelligence. What were some of those tools and techniques that really kind of resonated with you?
Well, I mean, you mentioned journaling, which I think is a great one.
Hmm.
I also really loved her suggestion of creating like a feelings vocabulary list. And it's basically just it's a list of different emotions and it's meant to like help you become more aware of, just the nuances of your own like emotional landscape.
Oh, that's a fantastic one. And I often find that people who, really struggle with this emotional neglect, they have a really hard time even just identifying what they're feeling.
Hmm.
Like they might just say, I feel bad or I feel off, but like without being able to actually pinpoint the specific emotion. Yeah,
Exactly. It's like
right.
they don't even have the words.
Yeah.
And then having that like more nuanced vocabulary can be so empowering, right? Because it allows you to then better understand your own needs and to actually communicate them more effectively to others.
Totally, yeah. It's like you're learning a new language almost,
Yeah.
the language of emotions.
Yeah.
And once you understand that language,
Hmm.
you can start to express yourself more authentically and connect with others like on a much, much deeper level.
And something else that Webb talks about is, okay, so you're starting to like identify these emotions, but like what do you do with them? Right. So she talks about the importance of finding healthy outlets for those emotions, so that could be things like creative expression,
Right.
physical activity, just spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones, like anything that helps you kind of process those emotions in a way that feels, safe and supportive.
Mm-hmm. Hmm. And what I love about that, is it really emphasizes that like the individualized nature of healing, like what works for one person might not work for another, right? It's all about finding what resonates with you, what helps you feel more grounded and connected to yourself.
So I think, as we kind of wrap up this deep dive into running on empty, I just want to leave you with this thought.
Mhm.
If you've resonated with any of what we've discussed today, just know that you're not alone in this. Emotional neglect is far more common than I think any of us really realize. And the good news is it's something that you can heal from.
Yeah. Start by being kind to yourself. Remember that awareness is the first step, and every small step you take toward filling your own tank, that's a victory. You deserve to live a life that's full of joy and connection and emotional well-being.